Now, what are some of the applications of population ecology? I kind of already talked a little bit about that, but let me come back again on some of those aspects and some I did not talk about so far. We have, for instance, conservation of endangered species. Now, how do we come to conserve endangered species? First of all, we have to know the count, at least an estimate of the count, and basically know what does it take to help that species not go to extinction. Okay, so by knowing, by applying population ecology, we can basically rescue uh, that species and prevent it to be brought to extinction. We have species that are threatened. Now, we consider that species are threatened when we notice a decrease, an important decrease in the population of that species, and also destruction of the habitat or modification. Now, when I say modification, it's a type of modification that can actually threaten the species. Um, what else do I want to address? Sustainable resource management. Okay, so for instance, for the population of deers in Tuscarawas County, well, there are periods of time where when it is allowed to hunt deers and when it is not allowed to hunt deers. So this is a way of managing in a sustained way the population of deers in Tuscarawas County. Okay, this is also true for several other species that are basically, for instance, for that are not allowed, that we are not allowed to hunt on. Okay, for instance, when I was living in Hawaii, there are some turtles, for instance, that you are not even allowed to touch. Why do we reach that point where we cannot touch some type of sea turtles? This is because they are endangered. Okay, and without population ecology, well, we would not come to this point and say that, hey, you know what, we should not hunt these turtles, we should not hunt this species or this other species. Okay, um, biological pest control. Well, biological pest control, we see that in farms, when applying pesticides, we have problems with resistance, pesticide resistance. That can be a problem. So basically, what is done in some area is to use living things to control the population of pests in a given area, okay, or in a given crop. Okay, now also most of the time nowadays you have more and more a combination of both biological pest control and um, insecticides or pesticides. So basically we call this integrated pest management. So integrated pest management is more and more applied in a place like, for instance, the United States. Now let's address the human population. The human population grew for really a long time in the history of human. The population was growing at a relatively low pace. Okay, up to um, up to the 1900 and the mid 1900. So in the mid 1900, there was a huge revolution. The health condition changed tremendously. Um, we improve our life conditions, and we have nowadays more and more improvement of technology, and that technology has allowed a country like United States to have a life expectancy that is beyond what most countries experience worldwide. So this basically this affects the global human population. So we have an increase of the human population since the 1900, and that increase has been exponential, and it has been so much that actually today there are more and more countries that are considering policies to limit the population, the birth rate in countries like, for instance, the United States. You have a family planning. You have countries like China, where you have one child policy. You have in Europe family planning as well, and actually in several countries in Europe, the populations are now getting more and more old. The elderly people are now more and more numerous compared to the young people. So this has both positive and negative impacts. Now, when looking at the age structure, now I already talked about the age structure. Now, but to be specific here, when we consider the age structure, we consider a country like the United States, we are going to notice that the United States is relatively large in the middle. What I mean by large in the middle, it's that the people in age of productivity, male and female, are more abundant than children and than elderly people. This is a pattern that we see in developed countries. While in developing countries, we are going to see a broad base and a really narrow top. So it's going to describe basically a pyramid. Okay. Now, what is the impact of the age structure as we consider population in developing countries versus developed countries? Like in the United States, for instance, we are looking at the age structure. We can predict that, well, people in age of productivity in the 20s up to 50s, 60s are going to be able to support correctly individuals that are not able to produce, like children and people who are retired. Okay, so they're going to be able to support them. Now, on the other hand, when we consider developing countries, where we have a broad base, so a huge number of children, a small and a little narrower midsection, so people in age of productivity are going to be less than children, and elderly people are going to be even more thin in terms of number. Well, what this shows is that the people in age of productivity are going to have to support a large basis. Okay, a large base. Okay, so a lot of children. The problem here is that, well, these people who are in age of productivity are not going to have sufficient means economically to take care of children, so that, for instance, they can afford college. And the problem is that if you cannot afford college, you cannot afford good education. Well, not having good education reduces also chances to have a good job. which basically creates a vicious circle of poverty. Okay, so the children who are growing in poverty are likely to remain poor. Okay, just because they do not receive enough support to basically get a good education, as opposition to developed countries, okay, where um, people, where children have more chance to have a good education because they have parents who are themselves educated and also have sufficient means to take care of them. Now, another thing that I want to address in the age structure of developing countries is that the elderly people, the size of the elderly people is relatively narrow. That shows that life expectancy it's very low in those developing countries.